The current charts and data we are seeing in the crypto market right now indicate that we can expect massive increases in the coming weeks. We will discuss all of this in today's video. We've also received new news regarding Blackrock. Just a few hours ago, we received information that Blackrock is going to increase its involvement in the RWA sector. That's why we've received new data here that we definitely need to take a look at, because something like this could of course be a huge catalyst for some altcoins. For this reason, towards the end of today's video, we'll also briefly discuss some altcoins where I personally see incredibly strong opportunities right now. So we definitely need to keep a very close eye on the charts here. Of course, we'll also talk about my own positions and any changes that may have occurred. We'll take a look at important charts that are currently circulating widely on social media. I also have a clearly controversial opinion on this. Honestly, it even makes me a bit angry what other YouTubers are claiming about the topic of altcoin season. We'll definitely take a look at that as well. And something that's especially important to me in today's video, we'll clearly go over the current roadmap, meaning the overall framework of what's currently in place. What foundation are we building on? What risks are still present at the moment? So I really want to examine everything from A to Z so that together we're optimally prepared for the next upswing in the crypto market. Because one thing I can tell you, among other things, I'm actually more bullish than ever, but more on that in today's video. Otherwise, if you're new to the channel, feel free to like and subscribe. That would definitely help me out a lot. And of course, feel free to check out the other videos as well. But now let's jump straight into the content and take a look. What is the current roadmap? What is the overarching framework? Just as a very quick recap, because I know that the loyal viewers among you have also watched the other YouTube videos. First of all, exactly what I mentioned in the last update video has happened. The liquidity on a monthly basis was above us, up to 117,000 US dollars. That's exactly what happened here on Saturday. At the moment, we are exactly at 116,000 US dollars for Bitcoin. So everything is still in place here. I had already shown in the last update videos exactly what my plan was, even 2 weeks ago. As I said, the loyal viewers among you definitely know what my plan was here. In this case, we perfectly caught the bottom with Bitcoin at 108 to 109,000 US dollars. And that's exactly how it looks at the current moment, as we've nicely returned to this area again. Of course, that's still no reason for FOMO or anything like that. At the end of the day, we are still in this box. Actually, it's pretty similar to the previous times as well. It's always a kind of spring that's being compressed. I showed exactly the same thing here on a weekly basis, that we got perfect support here. In this case, with my own indicator, the Vincent Momentum Bands, we got perfect support here. That's why we're exactly back in this area again, just as I've mentioned repeatedly. It's basically the kind of spring-loaded area where I've always said the spring is being compressed so that the next impulse can happen here with Bitcoin. The next price target is the 2.414 Fibonacci level at 140,000 US dollars. Just so you all are still up to date on that, that's all for the first point, at least for now. As I said, Bitcoin clearly remains in an uptrend. We have a nice structure here, with higher intermediate lows and higher intermediate highs. That's why I personally am also clearly of the opinion that this low will hold for Bitcoin. Personally, I can't imagine that we'll come back down to 100,000 US dollars or anything like that. In my view, the uptrend is still intact. That's all for now on that point. Now, just very briefly, a recap of the other 2 points. Topic, global liquidity and traditional markets. Things are looking very good there as well, because both in terms of global liquidity and in the traditional market, we're getting extremely strong tailwinds. We can see it right here at this point. Yes, I know we saw a short-term end to the correlation. Bitcoin was selling off, and at the same time, M2 money supply was rising. But things like this can definitely happen from time to time, that the correlation doesn't hold up in the short term. It's not particularly bad, because we're still getting fresh liquidity flowing into the market, and at the end of the day, fresh liquidity is the fuel for rising prices. And that's why it's definitely nice to see that, slowly but surely, Bitcoin is starting to catch up again. It's the same with the traditional markets, things are looking extremely good. The S&P 500 is hitting one all-time high after another. Now we can see it beautifully here with Bitcoin as well, just as we discussed in the last update video, that the probability is super high that sooner or later Bitcoin will pick up again, so that the correlation between, as mentioned, the S&P 500, traditional markets in general, and therefore Bitcoin will be maintained. As long as the S&P 500 keeps hitting one all-time high after another, the probability is extremely high that it's only a matter of time before Bitcoin also reaches new highs here. And then things will definitely get extremely exciting. And that's what we're going to talk about now, in general. Crypto market in focus. Altcoins are showing massive relative strength, just like Ethereum. So now we're definitely going to take a look at the Ethereum chart here. We can see it on the one hand with the altcoins. Altcoins are surging extremely strongly. As I said, we'll take a look at this chart right after this. I definitely have a pretty clear opinion on the topic of altcoin season. But as I said, first let's take a quick look at Ethereum. Everything still looks very clean there as well. In my own indicator, KVBSO, we've also just gotten a bullish cross here. That's definitely a nice point of reference as well. As I said, just so you're aware, everyone who's in my free Telegram group also gets access to all these indicators. Otherwise, everything here looks more than good as well. So the relative strength is really enormous. On the one hand, when looking at the Ethereum to Bitcoin ratio, we can see that there's a clear trend here. So as we can see both from my own indicator and from a MACD indicator, we've just gotten a beautiful bullish cross here. So we're definitely building on a very healthy foundation here. As I said, we can see it from these indicators. Even if we take a quick look at Ethereum on a daily basis, we can see quite clearly that the current structure has just been beautifully broken out of. We have to keep one thing in mind here. We're only about 5% away from reaching new all-time highs, which means Ethereum could break through the 5,000 US dollar mark. And then, in my opinion, the switch will definitely be flipped also for the topic of altcoins for altcoins in general. So a gigantic run could clearly be triggered as soon as Ethereum officially enters the price discovery phase. Let's take a look at the whole thing on a weekly basis. And as I said, we definitely need to see a weekly candle, basically a weekly candle close above the 5,000 US dollar mark. Something like that is definitely extremely important. In this case, a small wick that briefly goes above is definitely not enough for the price discovery phase, but at the moment the spring is also being beautifully compressed here. When I look at other indicators here as well, for example, if I look at the RSI, it's also nice to see that all the indicators are cooling off a bit. In this case, we were briefly a bit overbought, which isn't particularly good, but if you can clearly see that the indicators are cooling off while the price is slowly but surely moving upward, it's definitely the perfect foundation to build on. That's all for now on that topic. Now, let's move on to the topic of altcoins. Here we have some incredibly exciting charts, namely the crypto total market cap excluding Bitcoin and Ethereum. And what we're seeing here is truly of historical significance, and I'm not exaggerating at all or anything like that, because we saw the last all-time high here on November 8th, 2021, and this exact contact point is now being approached again at the current time. This means we have historical resistance levels that are now being broken through for the first time. After exactly 4 years, this is actually the exact moment we've been waiting for, or rather all altcoin investors have really just been waiting for this moment so that new all-time highs can happen here, and so that we can enter the price discovery phase. We already tested this once before, and that was exactly on December 2nd, 2024. Unfortunately, we didn't manage it here, so now we really have to keep a close eye on this chart to see what happens at this very moment. Whether there's a chance that we can sustainably break through this level to the upside so that the entire upward trend can continue to build. And at the moment, everything definitely looks more than good. Just as a little note, which is also important to mention, in this case, stablecoins are included in the calculation. There's actually another chart, and this chart is basically exactly the same as this one here. Just briefly so you understand the difference here. In this case, we have the crypto total market cap excluding Bitcoin and Ethereum, just like the other one. But in this case, the difference is that stablecoins are also excluded. So here, you could say the altcoin market is represented even better, since only altcoins are included in the calculation. And here we can clearly see that there is still a bit more room to the previous highs. But even so, things are looking more than good here as well. We have higher intermediate lows, higher intermediate highs, and we still have the indicator below us. In other words, the Vincent momentum bands have also provided perfect support here. So the structures are still perfectly intact here as well. So purely from a technical analysis perspective, what we can read from the charts is better than ever, in my opinion. The current fundamentals, the current starting position we have, are truly enormous. If Bitcoin even comes close to reaching new all-time highs, this will also lead to Ethereum reaching new highs, which in turn means that all the altcoins could really take off again. Now we're moving on to a chart that makes me a bit annoyed, because I've already seen on Twitter or from other YouTubers that they're saying the altcoin season is starting now. Now it's starting, or we're already in the middle of an altcoin season. Especially when you look at the charts from an altcoin season index, we've actually received the signal here that an altcoin season is currently happening. But in my opinion, that's total nonsense, because we really need to be clear about what actually defines an altcoin season. What parameters need to be met? In order to even be able to interpret such an indicator, we first need to understand how such an indicator is actually constructed. And here we can take a look at the information on how the indicator is put together in the first place. Specifically, we see here that only if 75% of the top 50 altcoins outperform Bitcoin over the past 90 days, is it considered an altcoin season according to this indicator. And that's why, personally, I don't think anything of this indicator at all. So in my opinion, anyone who seriously uses this indicator and interprets from it whether an altcoin season is happening or not is, to be honest, a bit lost, because it really doesn't have any meaningful significance. We can even take a look at the altcoin season index on CoinMarketCap, and what we can see here is that we have a gigantic outlier. In this case, it's about a new decentralized exchange, similar to Hyperliquid, and of course that's pushing the entire indicator up, which is why, in my opinion, we don't have a valid reference value for an altcoin season here. I can definitely guarantee you that. What we're seeing at the moment is definitely not an altcoin season. And anyone who tries to tell you otherwise, in my opinion, has absolutely no idea about the altcoin market or what an altcoin season is. So listening to the wrong people here can definitely be very dangerous for some viewers. That's why it's especially important to understand how such an indicator is actually put together. So please definitely be careful about that. Now, of course, a quick proper explanation. How does an altcoin season even happen? To summarize very briefly, an altcoin season can really only happen when Bitcoin enters the overheated zone. By the way, I also prepared a detailed video for you on this topic 3 months ago. In that video, I specifically addressed what actually defines an altcoin season. Specifically, Ethereum has to outperform Bitcoin, Bitcoin dominance must collapse, and Bitcoin must no longer be fairly valued. And that's basically the principle behind it. Bitcoin has to overheat, then Ethereum needs to outperform Bitcoin, and only then can liquidity rotate into the smaller projects so that you can actually see performances of 5 times, 10 times, or even much more. So here you have a complete overview once again. This is how the mechanism of an altcoin season really works. At the end of the day, it's individual and complex gears that mesh together, and you first have to understand this mechanism. That's why, in my opinion, it's absolute nonsense to rely on such charts. So please be careful here. It was extremely important to me to mention this again in today's video. That's all I have to say about that for now. Now on to the second point, which concerns the crypto market itself. Finally, let's move on to point number 3, which is about the current context, namely sentiment and market psychology. Right now, we have an incredibly strong foundation to build on. Simply because at the moment we are still in the neutral zone, and in general, if you take a look at social media interest, we can view data in the social risk score. In this case, on Into the Cryptoverse, we have a data reference value showing the current overall interest in crypto on social media, and right now we've reached a complete zero value. So at the moment, everything is basically completely dead. The general public isn't present, or the retail investors who later on provide that extra liquidity for us are missing. Of course, at the end of the day, we're also retail investors, but we still have to keep in mind that this broad mass, which always comes back whenever Bitcoin enters certain areas, is currently not present. That's why we actually have the best foundation here, because the lower the sentiment, the fewer people are involved, and the higher the prices are, the more potent the current setups become, the stronger the foundation is, and the greater the upside will be later on. If, for example, we were already in a range of 0.4 or 0.5, then I personally would definitely be worried, especially when it comes to the fear and greed index. If we were in a range of 80 or higher here, you definitely have to be careful, you have to watch out, but at the current moment, everything is definitely in the green zone. The neutral range is definitely perfect, especially when you consider that we're on the verge of reaching new all-time highs. So this is definitely the best starting point you could have. Apart from that, there is currently still the general possibility in the market that a kind of illusion of a soft landing could arise, meaning that a dream scenario is priced in for the short term. In that case, the conditions would have to be inflation seems controllable, plus the labor market remains stable, plus growth without a recession becomes possible. I've also put together a brief overview for you here regarding the current macro scenarios for 2025. The best case, of course, would be that inflation cools down so that we get the inflation problem in the US under control, and in combination the labor market stabilizes. That would, of course, be perfect for the Fed, so that further key interest rate cuts could be priced in. And something like that would naturally present a kind of dream scenario for the overall market, which would also cause traditional markets to skyrocket, because in such a scenario, a soft landing could be priced in. That would, of course, be optimal. The base case scenario, or let's say the realistic scenario, is that inflation remains at an elevated level or stabilizes somewhere, as is currently the case. The labor market remains robust, but is starting to show the first cracks. This would mean that monetary policy remains cautious. Interest rates either stay high, or if they do fall, only do so slowly. If something like this does happen, of course you have to keep a close eye on everything, but even in this case, in my opinion, all the conditions are still in place for an altcoin season and for new all-time highs. However, everything will take a bit longer because, as I said, certain problems still exist here. You definitely have to keep an eye on something like this. The worst case scenario would be inflation rises again and the labor market collapses significantly. Something like that would definitely pose a risk of stagflation. Especially the inflation problem, of course, is extremely important to keep an eye on. If some of you have been following the latest economic data, you will definitely have noticed that the crypto market reacts quite sensitively to certain economic data, especially inflation data. That's why it's also important to keep an eye on the overall macro picture so you don't make any structural mistakes in your own plan. But as I said, at the moment everything looks more than fine. So now let's transition to my own positions. What are my trading bots doing? What are my long positions doing? Let's take a look at that. I'm still extremely heavily long position because I'm absolutely convinced that this low point in Bitcoin is the local bottom. So I really can't imagine something like that happening. So here you definitely have my clear roadmap. We can also take a look at the details here, and it's of course very nice to see that the individual volatility is being taken advantage of again and again. So basically I have a grid profit here. Regardless of how Bitcoin behaves, I still earn my regular profits from the individual grid trades. So basically, when you buy cheap and sell high, even if Bitcoin just stays flat, I benefit from the overall volatility, and this runs like a common thread throughout. In every single trading bot, we have incredibly strong grid profits here. And of course, it's also perfect if you're positioned long accordingly, because then you also profit from the price increases. And that definitely gives you some insight into the individual bots. I'm absolutely convinced by them. In some cases, we have grid profits of 31% here, which in this case also represents a very solid annual performance. I'm honestly really impressed by what's happening here in some cases, also with chaining. Here, plus 41% just from the grid profit. That's really very solid because you can clearly outperform the market here even when not much is happening. And that's the big advantage of trading bots, of automated trading. You can still profit even when the market is relatively boring. Even if, in the case of Bitcoin, the spring gets pushed down further and something like that happens, I'll still continue to profit with my bots. So that's a clear recommendation from me. As I said, I'm always extremely cautious when it comes to recommendations in general, but when I'm truly convinced, when I really see that something works, when you can actually make money and it's also relatively simple. Yeah, you really don't have to put much effort into it. Everything runs passively, automated in the background. Once you've set the right parameters, everything works very smoothly here. At this point, I can only recommend you check out this video from 2 weeks ago. In that one, I specifically explained how I set up new trading bots so you'll know exactly how it works. Otherwise, I've linked everything in the video description. You can even try out the platform completely for free. If you use the link in my bio, you'll get a $500 bonus when you deposit $3,000. It's extremely convenient if you want to take things slow and ease into it at first. That's all I have to say about that for now. Now let's move on to the part about Blackrock. We've actually received some new news here, and this is where things get especially exciting. What's really happening behind the scenes, especially at Blackrock. Let's take a look at that. Blackrock now wants to tokenize individual assets, meaning specific stocks, and bring them onto the blockchain. That's pretty incredible when news like this hits the market. Something like this can of course be a huge catalyst for some altcoins or for a specific narrative in the altcoin market. So let's take a look at what, let's say, the data currently shows us behind the scenes. What we have in front of us right now are, so to speak, stocks that are being tokenized and brought onto the blockchain. And at the moment, we're seeing an extremely strong trend toward tokenization. We can also see here the individual players who are benefiting the most from this, with Ondo, for example, up 327% over the last 30 days, and also seeing an incredible increase in market share. And something like this is, of course, extremely important to watch as an altcoin investor, so that you can be among the first to benefit the most from such narratives. And that's why it's especially important to always keep an eye on things like this. Of course, I'll keep you updated here on my YouTube channel as well. When it comes to individual trends or specific trade setups, we'll talk about that in a moment. I'll share my approach with you. But as I said, we can clearly see growth, and this is becoming extremely noticeable, especially now in August and September 2025. It's actually quite recent that we're seeing this incredible surge in liquidity and tokenized assets here. This is definitely something that's very noticeable, and that's why, in my opinion, it's more important than ever to pay close attention to the narrative of real-world assets, where assets are being tokenized and brought onto the blockchain. And in this context, it's especially important to bet on the front runners. That's why I'm personally clearly invested in Chainlink. It's definitely a major position in my own portfolio. Stellar XLM is also perfectly fine. HedgeSpar is fine too. I like it. Ondo, of course. I also find Ondo incredibly strong at the current time. In my opinion, we're also in a price range here where it would still be legitimate to buy more or set up bots. So I will actually set up new trading bots for myself privately on Ondo right after this, because I can really well imagine that Ondo will deliver a good performance again, even here within this context. In this case, I have now shown a Fibonacci trend channel. We are still in the lower range. I'll be completely honest with you. As soon as Ondo reaches a price of $1.50 or higher, I definitely won't buy in again here, and I definitely won't open any new positions. But as long as Ondo stays in this range, let's say plus or minus $1, it's still legitimate in my opinion. So for me personally, Ondo is clearly undervalued here, especially when you look at data like this at the current time, showing that real adoption is actually happening. Blackrock is involved. As we all know, Blackrock is also extremely strongly partnered with Ondo. Ondo is the big driving force. And of course, just like Chainlink, as already mentioned. Otherwise, Injective is also something I really like a lot at the current time. We can take a look at it here. Injective is now also back above the 0.786 Fibonacci level, has found perfect support here, and is also beautifully in an uptrend. We can see quite clearly here, higher intermediate lows, higher intermediate highs. This is, in my opinion, the perfect setup. For me personally, it's also not too expensive yet. For me personally, the reference point here is the Fibonacci golden pocket level at 0.618, 0.65. If we go above that, in my opinion, it's too late, a bit too expensive. But as long as we're in the price range of 14 to 15 US dollars, it's perfectly reasonable to build new positions here. Here as well, in my opinion, there's still a good opportunity to set up new grid bots. Especially new long grid bots, of course, since you can take advantage of a beautiful upward trend here. Just like with Casper, I really like it at the current moment. Higher intermediate lows, it's wonderful to see things like that. We also still have beautiful momentum in the KVBSO. I also really like it, and in my opinion, if I'm being honest, it's only a matter of time before something like this happens. Before we reach price ranges of 20 cents, 30 cents, 40 cents, and maybe in the best case scenario, 50 or 60 cents. Personally, I will take my first profits when we're around 30 US dollars. As soon as we sustainably break through the all-time high here, you definitely need to make sure to slowly but surely start reducing your positions. That's the plan with Casper. Otherwise, there's also Clearpool, which is kind of the little brother to Ondo. If I see, okay, Blackrock is getting involved, Blackrock could potentially be a strong catalyst for the RWA sector here. I can clearly see that Ondo is performing extremely well. So for me personally, it's only a logical conclusion that the so-called little brother of Ondo will follow suit. And that's why I'm personally invested and still convinced about Clearpool. Higher interim lows, higher interim highs. Here too, although we bounced off the Fibonacci golden pocket level, we still have a nice upward trend going. And that's why I'm still clearly invested there as well. That's all I have to say about that for now. As I said, I'm not being paid by any of these altcoins, just so you're aware. I just wanted to mention it because when you notice something like this, especially in the background, a lot of investors, especially beginners, focus solely on the charts, on the price. What's the price doing? When are we finally going to pump? But for me personally, as a truly experienced investor, it's extremely important to also look at what's going on behind the scenes, what is really happening in the background. And that's how you can identify trends and narratives early on, allowing you to position yourself before the general public jumps into the market, before everyone starts talking about RWA again, before everyone talks about Blackrock or similar things. It's important to observe all these moves right now. So now you're definitely in the know. That's actually it for today's video. Of course, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Once again, it was packed with value. If you enjoy videos like this, feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a comment as well. What's your current approach? I think it was definitely quite helpful to give you a clear roadmap of what my approach is, and also my reasoning that certain catalysts are in place for the coming weeks is, I think, pretty self-explanatory. Here's an overview of all the scenarios from the current point in time. Otherwise, as I said, feel free to tune in for upcoming videos as well. Definitely join the Telegram group. There, I'll definitely keep you updated on personal trade setups. As I said, so you're in the loop, just sign up via Pionex or Bitfinex, send me your UID privately on Telegram at CryptoVincent22, and then I'll add you to my Telegram group completely free of charge. Otherwise, if you're completely new to the crypto market and you're still looking for a MICA-regulated crypto exchange, I can also recommend Bitpanda. I've also linked it for you in the video description. Otherwise, as I said, I mainly use Bitfinex for trading, and for all the trading bots, I use Pionex. So it's clear that Pionex is #1 when it comes to trading bots. And as you can see here, these are all the interim results. I'll keep you updated on that in future videos. Otherwise, as I said, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you again in the next YouTube video.